factor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, can I ask then, stepping a little bit back from primates as well, how does this selection work in the era of swiping right and left? What is your reaction to the way young people date today?
Oh, that's a good. I was really hoping we'd get into that. I was really because
well, you were very into the monkeys, so I didn't want to interrupt.
No. Well, I should close off the Scandinavian discussion just by pointing out, and this is something that the Scandinavians are really going to have to wrestle with, is that if you institute effective policies to promote equality of opportunity, which the Scandinavians have done, you're going to produce some equality, so like a 50-50 distribution of men and women in the workplace, but you're also going to exacerbate certain kinds of inequality, and you can't get out of that. So you cannot have equality of opportunity and equality of outcome together. They don't work together. And equality of outcome, the essential equality of outcome doctrine, which is often described with the code word equity, is that at every level of every occupation, the people have to be represented by the same number that they're represented in at the population. So if it's not 50-50 men and women in each occupation and in each strata at each occupation, then that's sort of prima facie evidence for discrimination and for systemic discrimination. It's like, nope, sorry, you have to factor in choice, and choice actually turns out to be a very important determinant. And as the society gets flatter and flatter, choice becomes a more and more important determinant. And so what that essentially means is that the most radical end of the left-wing political agenda is logically impossible, apart from the fact that it's impossible for a variety of other reasons.
And they should look at the data. I mean, it's just a cliche now of, in any group of activists, and they'll say, oh, well, we need, in order for women to achieve equality, we need government-funded daycare, and we need online. They have it in Sweden.
Yeah.
Sweden has fewer women in managerial levels. Yeah. American women are ahead. In fact, now they have quotas over there, so they need female CEOs and females on board.
But it hasn't made any difference.
They're bringing in American women because we're so much further ahead.
Yeah.
So it's
made no difference in the distribution of men and women lower in the hierarchy.
No, it's called the Nordic paradox.
Yeah.
And
okay, you guys are so wonky. I want to get back to
Okay, so yes, that's good.
I think we all want to get back to data.
I want to get back to these monkeys.
I was thinking this morning about, I was talking to a variety of political types, and we were talking about...
this morning?
Yeah.
In D.C.?
Hard to believe.
Who?
Hard to believe. No, I'm not telling you.
Okay.
A bunch of Republicans here, and I've been talking to Democrats as well, but it was mostly Republicans here. And we were talking about abortion, and I made a case that that's really not a very productive discussion, because you're talking about a problem way too late in the sequence of problems. So by the time the discussion starts to be about abortion, there's 50 problems that have already emerged that no one has addressed. And some of those problems are, the fundamental problem is how human beings should regulate their sexual behavior. And that's a big problem. And you think, well, and there's an interesting thing that's happening, because the people on the right would say, well, that's easy. It's like, don't sleep around and get married and have sex with your marital partner, and that'll solve the problem. So there's strictures on sexual behavior, and those would be the traditional ones. And what you see on the left is that there's this weird paradoxical demand, let's say, that people should be allowed to express their sexuality in any manner that they choose, whenever they want, but that sex is so dangerous that it has to be carefully regulated at every single stage of the interaction. And so you know that many state legislatures have now followed the example of university campuses and put it in affirmative consent legislation, so that every move you make towards physical intimacy has to be preceded by the instantiation of a verbal contract, essentially. It's like, well, can I take your hand? Yes. You actually, from what I understand, you actually have to say yes. Like, nodding is not sufficient, and so each stage has to be preceded by affirmative consent, and which well, I won't say anything about. Yeah, I will. It's absurd. It's absurd to assume that that's how human intimate relationships are supposed to proceed, and then you have complicated laws emerging that are part of that for example, this is the case in California, as I understand it, is that you cannot give affirmative consent if you're intoxicated. Okay, so you think about that. It's like, well, what does that mean?
It means that like a lot of sex
Is illegal.
has been illegal for a long time,
Yes.
including
Marital.
including,
Yes, that's what it seems to mean.
on my honeymoon. Okay,
Well, that is.
I'm rethinking it.
It seems.
I'm rethinking
It
it.
seems to me. It seems to mean, it seems to me to mean the California legislation that if you have sex with your wife or husband and either of you is intoxicated, then you're either one of you or both is guilty of rape. That's what it looks like to me.
Actually, I was in a debate a few years ago at the University of Virginia Law School, and I turned to my debate partner and said, so if what you're saying is right, two people can rape one another.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And she said, yes. And I thought, oh, shit. I mean, how can that be?
Well, that's the question. Well, okay, so then I would say, well, it's interesting because I think that a lot of this confusion has emerged fundamentally as a consequence of the birth control pill. So, because you got to think situationally before you think ideologically or psychologically. It's like, it seems to me that the 20th century will be remembered for the hydrogen bomb, the transistor, and the birth control pill. And those are unbelievably radical technological innovations. And maybe the most...
Internet came in.
Yeah, but
My
it's
Fair Lady,
dependent on
My
the-
Fair Lady. Just saying.
It's dependent on the transistor, because it
Oh, okay,
spawned
yes,
all
okay,
of
got it,
that.
got it.
So that's the big technological innovation that spawned all that. And of the three, I would say the birth control pill is probably the bigger hydrogen bomb. So, and because it changed the fundamental biological nature of women and men. And because it gave women, for the first time in biological history, the option of choosing their reproductive status.
Yeah.
And that's
We like that.
That's well, yes and no. Like, yes, we like it. But it's
did.
not something that's come without a tremendous, it's
Have you
come
been
with
reading
tremendous
Lionel
complexity.
Tiger? A fellow Canadian. Have you been reading Lionel
No,
Tiger?
no, I
I
haven't.
think you'll find him interesting because he writes about that.
Well, and I'm not making a case for the abolition of the birth control pill by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm pointing at its complexity. And so, because one of the questions is, well, once you can regulate your reproductive function, what attitude should you have towards sex? And one answer might be, the more of it under the more varied circumstances, the better, because why not? And I would say that was actually part of the attitude that emerged in the aftermath of the birth control pill in the 1960s, right? And it was a reasonable response in some sense because it's such a cataclysmic change that you don't know what it implies. Well, what's the consequence of that? Well, first of all, people aren't reliable enough to use birth control in an entirely reliable manner. So even though it can work at near 100% efficiency, you have to take it extraordinarily regularly and in a disciplined manner for that to work. And so there was still the problem of unwanted pregnancy, let's say. And then there was the problem of the proliferation of sexual epidemics, and that culminated in AIDS, which could have easily wiped all of us out, but didn't. But there's other sexual epidemics that could have had the same effect, but we've been fortunate enough to escape them. And then more recently, there's been this weird inversion, especially on the radical left, that points to the reemergence of something like a set of sexual taboos. Like I think the idea that sex is casual and that it's a form of entertainment I think it's an absolutely preposterous idea. I think that it's psychologically shallow beyond belief to hold that as a core proposition, because it forces you to, first of all, if it's repetitive sex with multiple partners, it forces you to treat people as if they're interchangeable. And I don't see how that's good for you psychologically or for the people that you're using interchangeably. It implies that you can divorce sexuality from play, from the desire for a relationship, from emotional fragility, from love, from family, from responsibility, all of those things that are part and parcel of everyone, and I don't think you can, and I don't think people's experience indicates that you can, and especially on the emotional front. And I think that's partly what's driving. And there's also a residual sense that there's something about sex that's fundamentally dangerous, and maybe it's dangerous emotionally and personally, and maybe it's dangerous socially and psychologically, which it most certainly is, because it's a powerful force. And the way the left is reacting to that is by insisting that all forms of sexual behavior are valid and that it's reasonable to manifest all of them, but that it's simultaneously so dangerous that absolutely every aspect of it has to be state regulated and in an increasingly draconian form. And so I think what needs to happen is that the left and the right have to get together and have a real discussion about what constitutes valid sexual morality. And that's the conversation you have to have way before you worry about solving the abortion debate, which is very divisive and very intractable.
Well, one of the things we talked about actually just last week on the podcast is this cover story in The Atlantic about the sexual recession amongst young people, that despite the advent of the birth control pill, abortion is going down.
But there's
there's
the
less
sex.
sex.
There's
Everything
less
is going down.
Hookup, fewer hookups.
Have you
can't
looked
help
into that? Do you
worry
have an
about that.
opinion on that?
Well, if you raise the cost of something, you decrease its prevalence. And I think that it seems to be,
Dangerous now to hook up.
Well,
you don't know what'll happen.
I kind of think that it's also a reflection of the same thing that Bloomberg reported on just a few days ago. They said that across businesses, men are thinking, I'm not spending any time with a single woman that isn't, associated with me in some formal manner, like my wife. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to mentor young women. I'm not going to be in a room alone with them.
Because I could face career annihilation.
Absolutely, and instantly.
They're frightened of young women now.
But as Kate Julian said, that's part of it. But we can over-exaggerate the part. I mean, anxiety and depression is going up amongst both young men and young women. Suicide is going up. It's not just a, most people I think are not. We're talking about an elite demographic who is into the consent and political correctness and workplace. This is across the board, and it's global. It's happening even in Sweden.
It's really happening in Japan.
Yeah, and Japan, exactly. So
Weird things are
and that
happening in
speaks
Japan.
to, and especially in Japan, they have people, especially young men, have given up on intimacy, and that having sex is actually.
But have
too
they
much
given
trouble.
up on the sex robots?
Right.
No.
Well, right. Well,
The
that's
Hello
the
Kitty
question.
robots.
Well, and there's pornography.
Yeah,
There's
lots of
pornography.
Like basically zero risk
But even
sexual
when
behavior.
you allow for pornography, that men and women will sort of separate that from their actual sex life. But anyway, we're seeing a whole, I guess, collapse of intimacy, let alone sex. And I don't think that's just explained by the political nature. So I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I don't know the literature on the decline in sexual activity well enough to know if it's valid or reliable. But I think that in a stable society, you take lots of things for granted. You take the fact that men and women are going to be sexually attracted to one another for granted. And even though it's more fragile than it appears, it's suppressed more easily than you might think. And you take the idea that men and women are going to move together towards the establishment of long-term intimate relationships for granted. But that's partly because you don't understand what invisible preconditions exist to make that self-evident. And when those invisible preconditions are disrupted by rapid technological or sociological change, then things shift underneath you and you don't know why.
A lot of it is traced to the advent of the smartphone, especially in the Generation Z. That Kate was explaining this to us, that you could see it was broadband internet and the smartphone that led to this, increasing fall off of relationships.
Yeah, well, maybe the abstract is more interesting than the proximal.
Right.
You see that
Kate,
when you're having dinner with people.
I want to know the truth. Have you ever been with somebody you loved and found fascinating and all that, but you really wanted to get back to your smartphone? Has that ever happened?
Yeah, well, it happens all the time.
It happens to me.
Yeah,
She'll
Christina,
never admit it.
No,
Yeah.
it happens during our podcast. To tell you to put your phone down.
No, I'm researching
Well,
things for the
they're very
purpose of the
addictive.
podcast.
They're very addictive.
Yeah, they're very addictive.
let
And I read the other day that
They're very alluring.
They are.
We're kind of going together.
The preferred method of interpersonal communication between young people now is texting rather than face-to-face communication.
Right, and the swiping that apes don't.
Well,
swipe.
that's a very interesting topic too. Like the Tinder phenomenon. Because that's also a major technological revolution. Because what it's done, I would say, for the first time, is reduce the cost of rejection to males to zero, because it hides it. The only people you ever hear from are people who haven't rejected you.
Although but there was one man who had to make 300. He actually tallied it.
Yeah.
He had to make 300 requests of swiping right or whatever
To
for one
yield
reply.
one.
So I think he had the sense of rejection.
Sure, but it's massively attenuated.
Yeah.
And it's
because-
not observed.
Yeah, you're not being humiliated.
Not at
Right,
all.
right.
Not at all. It's
Right.
really at arm's length, and you can
Right.
swipe very, very rapidly, and so you can get all that rejection over with in a very short period of
Right,
time.
it's like losing a video game or something. You go on to the
or
next.
less. Because
Worse. Not nearly as bad.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know what, and I mean Tinder also reduces the. One of the other things that you want to think about with regards to sex, and I think this is probably particularly true for women, is that to what degree is it in women's interests to allow the cost of sex to fall to zero? Because with pornography certainly does that. And it just seems to me that that's not a very good long-term strategy for relationships between men and women, because whatever sex is worth, the cost of zero is the wrong price. Mm-hmm. And so that's, I've
You can
heard
go to the
from,
bunny ranch and pay quite a bit for it.
well, true, but that's true. But you don't have to. And
No.
I've heard from a number of women read blog reports on their frustration with their attempts to be relatively sexually selective. Like, let's say they decide that they're not going to sleep with their new partner on the first date. They're frustrated by the fact that to the degree that they're being cautious in their sexual behavior, which I think is actually an admirable idea, that they're instantly outcompeted, especially if their partners are somewhat impulsive, by women who will say yes at the drop of a hat. And so, well, again, I don't think, it depends on what the goal is. That's the thing, is that there's short-term sexual gratification, but the literature indicates that married couples, for example, or couples in a permanent long-term monogamous relationship are more sexually satisfied than single people. And maybe the single people have to be parsed out into those who are sexually successful and those who aren't. But I suspect that wouldn't make that much difference. But whatever. There's the utility of relatively immediate sexual gratification, for whatever that's worth, and the adventurousness that goes along with that, let's say, the hunt and the excitement of having a new partner and all of that, and maybe even the danger that's associated with that, because people like to have a little bit of danger in their life. But what's the goal? It's like, what do people want? And I mean, there's a great book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts that was written by Google engineers. And so it contains great psychology, because Google engineers don't care about political correctness, and they just write down what they find, and they don't even notice that it's politically incorrect. Hence James Damore, for example. And what they found was that women use pornography just as much as men, but the pornography that women use is verbal. It's not imagistic. And that the pornographic novels, essentially, follow the same extraordinarily standard plot line, to the degree that publishing houses like Harlequin, which
I was going to say it's the bodice rippers, the
that's
romance
right.
novels.
Yeah, right. So in the Harlequin series, you have the ones that were published like in the 1970s that are they're tame. There's a small bit of,
They're pretty hot, actually.
well, there's a variety. They range from
them.
completely tame to essentially to hardcore pornography. But the plots are quite similar, and the plot is young, relatively innocent woman finds powerful, interesting, dangerous male, tames him, and then they live happily ever
Everlasting
after.
love.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, and it's the Beauty and the Beast plot, which is a fundamental.
Wasn't the
which is a
biggest search for women on Pornhub we discovered? We did an episode on porn. Was for women it was rape? Wasn't that like the
No, lesbianism. Or at least that was your porn. Yeah, that was your
That's
search.
not me.
Oh, okay. I don't know.
You know what my porn is? Going to the Williams-Sonoma store.
I know. It is. It is female porn.
All those pots.
Oh, the pots and pans.
No,
but
but
Bill
seriously-
Maher,
Calm
the
down.
philosopher Bill Maher,
Yeah.
once said that men and women should never tell one another their fantasies, because women are outraged by what we say, and we're totally bored by what they say. And I thought, like, women have kind of these scenarios and, I don't know, unicorns. I don't know what they're doing. Storylines. And men is just like, I don't want to say this to you, but it is a lot of just close-ups of female body parts.
Yeah, well, men are much more visually oriented sexually.
But now they're being shamed. I mean, now it's called the male gaze. And so there's all of this like, oh my God, the Sports Illustrated is exploiting the female figure. I say, yeah, I mean, men like it. And I'm worried that now, sort of the way in the past sexual gays were shamed, we're now reversing it and shaming like heterosexual.
Yes, that's definitely happening.
Remember, we had the young woman who complained about being whistled at, and I said, "Don't worry, it stops."
Yeah.
Do we have a little bit of time for a couple more topics with you? Because one of the things that is coming out of this younger generation, and you have a chapter of it in your book, which I don't.
Sorry, I wanted to finish the line that we were pursuing.
Oh, sorry.
I should do that.
Sorry.
Well, with sexual behavior, the question is, what's the end game? And this is what people have to ask themselves. Is like one of the corollaries to the female pornographic romance is actually the establishment of a long-term relationship. And the question is, it's so funny because I got pilloried in the New York Times for talking about enforced monogamy. It's quite interesting, because
that gets brought up like in every snarky interview.
Ridiculous. It was so ridiculous. I talked to that woman for two days.
I know, and it's just like a little side comment, and then that became like the
Can you just
the
explain,
showcase.
like enforced monogamy? You mean forced marriage, or?
No, I mean that it was an anthropological term which she knew perfectly well because she's a very smart person. And all it means is that there's a pronounced proclivity in human societies around the world to enforce monogamous relationships at multiple levels of the sociological hierarchy. You do it culturally, you do it in expectation, you do it legally. And enforced monogamy, so my son was just married, and if he came to me next year and he said, hey, Dad, guess what? I've managed to have 4 affairs in the last year with hot women, and my wife hasn't found out about any of them. I'm not going to pat him on the back and say, good job, kid. I'm going to say, what the hell's up with you? You violated the vow that you took. You're putting your whole future at risk. You're betraying yourself and your wife. And well, that's enforced monogamy. The idea is that the social norm is the establishment of a long-term monogamous relationship, and that there are strictures put in place to support that, but also to punish deviation from it. And you say, well, maybe not so much on the punishment end, but it depends. It's like, what do you want? What is it that you want? You want a long-term stable relationship or not? And if that's the goal, then your behavior should be devoted to whatever it is that facilitates that goal. And I certainly don't see that casual and impulsive sex fits that bill, not in the least. And all of the evidence with regards to living together shows that that's actually detrimental to the establishment of a long-term relationship. So first of all, common law marriage, people who are in a common law marriage are much more likely to be divorced. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, people who live together before they get married are much more likely to be divorced after they get married. So the idea that, well, you can try someone on for size and see how it works, and then you're going to see if you're compatible. It's like, that's one story. Another story is, well, how about you and I live together for a little while, and, if you're not so bad, but maybe I can find someone better, and if I do, in the next year and a half or so, because we're not hooked together in any formal way, I can just trade you in. It's okay, you can do the same to me. But I don't really see that as the sort of complementary mutual interaction that leads to the formulation of long-term trust. And I think it's a better story for interpreting what constitutes living together than, well, we're going to try each other out because that's what mature people would do.
It's a lease or a rental.
Yeah, well, that's right.
Wash the rental cars, Reagan used to say.
Yeah, well, that's it. But most importantly, the data indicate that it doesn't work. Is that you're more likely to get divorced, not less likely. Because maybe the right attitude is, well, you're probably about as flawed as me, and we're lucky that we found each other, and so let's see if we can make a commitment because we're engaging in something that's very risky, an intimate relationship, and we're going to commit to each other and see if we can build something of value across time. And there's a definite risk in that, but there's a complement to your partner. It's like, well, I think you're worth making a sacrifice for. And what's the sacrifice? Well, it's everyone else. It's a big sacrifice. And if you don't see that as a compliment, then I don't think you're thinking, because not only is it a compliment, it's sort of like the ultimate compliment. And maybe you don't get to have a marriage that works without that complement. Maybe it's so difficult to establish a long-term relationship that's functional that you have to make a walloping sacrifice very early on in the relationship in order for that to even be a possibility. And maybe not, because what the hell do we know about what binds people together? But it's not that easy to stay with someone for a long period of time. It's a real commitment. It takes a tremendous amount of effort. So anyway.